Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. On today's agenda we'll be taking a look at the Los Angeles Classic GT24 held on the weekend of April 13th to 14th, 2024. As always, we'll take a look at the Votann placings in terms of what he scored, we'll do a deep dive into the list analysis, we'll discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and of course we'll contextualize the results of the placing by looking at the matchups. The list in today's episode was piloted by none other than Junior Afleji, who also featured on this channel before in the past. So congratulations, Junior. You've now been here twice. Junior came 7th out of 49 players at the event, taking home a 4-win, 0-draw, and 1-loss victory. Pretty good. Matchups included a 100 to 45-point victory against Necrons, a 72 defeat against Grey Knights at 77, so a very close game here. Volten at 100 versus Imperial Guard at 54. Volten at 63 versus Genestealer Cults at 37. Not an army we see too often. And then Volten at 98 versus Death Guard at 75 for the final game. Before we take a look at the list, I just want to give a quick shout out to our community Discord, where you can join free of charge by following the link down in the description below. Come join the channel to talk all things Votann tactics related, share your competitive lists with us for feedback, and engage in wonderful hobby posts with like-minded kin. You may even get your pictures featured on the channel, as we see here with this beautifully painted Ioneer champion submitted by Primo Carrot. So if you want to join a growing community of Votann enthusiasts, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our Discord server using the link in the description below. With that said, let's jump on into the list. Kicking things off, we have a Brokir Iron Master, no enhancements taken on this character, and he's going to be accompanying a 6-man unit of Brokir Thunderkyn, all of which, of course, are equipped with the Graviton Blast Cannon. I'm personally not a big fan of the Brokir Thunderkyn. I understand the desire to bring these because they do pack a ton of anti-vehicle punch. The problem for me is actually getting them into range to deliver that punch. You see, they only have movement speed 5, they're a pretty big footprint, and they're only range 18. What this means is that you're pretty susceptible to getting zoned out if you're trying to come in from reserves if your opponent is properly screening, and it also means if you decide to start on the table, it's going to take you a few turns of movement before you can actually deliver these guys into the fray. Also worth mentioning, being at only 5-inch move, there's a very fair chance that you might not be able to get all of them in one activation within line of sight to your target. This means that you're going to be providing your target with the benefit of cover, which you do not ignore. Couple that with the ability to turn off AP, like Armor of Contempt, and suddenly your AP2 shots are AP0, meaning you've essentially neutered the output of this unit. That said, they're one of those units that your opponent has to be careful with and play around, which that in itself provides a lot of innate value. Whether you start them on the table or in reserves, your opponent is going to be committing resources, both physically and mentally, to avoid them. Now, if you do decide to bring the unit, I agree with Junior's approach with taking a 6-man squad with the Iron Master. I think this is the most effective use you could get out of your Brokir Thunderkyn. The simple reason being, we're adding to their efficiency. We're ensuring that the damage that they inflict is optimized in such a way, with the +1 to hit, that we will always get the most amount of value that we can out of this unit. This is great for 2 reasons specifically. Firstly, we're not reliant on a judgment token on our target. What this means is that you have the ability to go for something else that isn't necessarily a priority target that you want to put your tokens on for some other units in your list to take care of. You have the option flexibly to go for something else and allocate your tokens elsewhere, which is pretty good. The second thing, as I mentioned before, is that we've optimized that efficiency, and we see this through not only the fact that we're ensuring that we hit on 3s, but also that if you do shoot at something with a judgment token and the Iron Master is attached to the unit, you're essentially at a blank +2 to hit, which is really helpful if you're shooting at something that has stealth, for example. Yes, you can actually go to BS2, but you are able to negate the -1 that your opponent might have on the target. All in all, the Brokir Iron Master, in my opinion, is an auto take if you're running 6 Thunderkyn. The next character we see in the list is an Ioneer champion running Grim Demeanor, and as always we're taking the Mass Hammer just to help deliver some extra punch and take full advantage of the enhancements equipped by the model. The model is also taking a teleport crest instead of the Weaver field. I'm not 100% sure if I like this approach. Personally, I would much rather have the durability on my character, because once he is out of the unit, he'll probably just melt, and having that 4++ could come in handy to add a little bit extra survivability, get a little bit more value out of that Grim Demeanor, and make sure that you land a few more punches before you go down. That said, with the inclusion of teleport, I'm inclined to believe that the Ioneer champion is leading the big 10-man brick of Ioneer Hearthguard. This 10-man unit has a Hesir with a concussion hammer, objectively the best weapon you could take for the squad, Falconites, and concussion gauntlets. This is a fairly standard loadout that we've seen time and time again. We discussed it in our unit analysis video, which you could check out if you're interested in learning a bit of the math behind the decision making. But ultimately what it provides you with is a very flexible unit that has quite a lot of punch into several different target profiles. Very viable, very effective, and pretty powerful. Now you'll notice that the Hesir is running a Weaver field crest, providing the unit with a 4++. Typically, as I said before, we'll see the inverse where the champion is the one taking the 4++ and the Hesir takes the teleport crest. Maybe there's an argument to be made that by putting the Weaver field crest on the Hesir, you provide slightly more durability to the Hearthguard unit if something were to shoot at it and push you past that threshold for your invulnerable save. At least this way, you have the chance of probably saving on a 4+, being a 50-50, instead of possibly pushing yourself to a 5+ or 6+ save. We also have the inclusion of a Cal, and the Cal is going to be accompanying a 5-man Ioneer Hearthguard squad instead. This isn't too common, in fact. We actually typically see the Cal accompanying a 10-man brick, but there has been a trend recently showing us that people are beginning to take an Ioneer champion with their larger Hearthguard bricks as well, simply out of the value of getting the reroll charges and the added benefit of their damage through Grim Demeanor. The champion is also significantly cheaper than a Cal, which is a bit of a travesty because in my opinion the Cal slightly overcosted coming in at 70 points. I'd much rather prefer to see this guy down to 65. I think then it'd be a little bit of a fairer choice between the two, but the Cal does provide some value here, giving you lethal hits. We do usually see the lethal hits come into play with the Plasma squad, but in this case he's accompanying the 5-man Hearthguard who are running a very similar loadout to the 10-man brick, being Falconites, concussion gauntlets, and a Hesir with a hammer. The big difference is that the Hesir is running a teleport crest, which we'll see come into play a little bit later. I don't disagree with the idea of having a Cal accompany a 5-man brick, let alone one that has the Vulcanites. In fact, it's an idea that I think is quite interesting. From my experience, the Hearthguard are obviously one of our top performing units. However, the mass volume of shots sometimes falls a little bit short when we're talking about doing damage to a higher toughness target. And I think this is where the lethal hits might be a little bit more interesting, especially if you're going to be having this smaller unit start on the board, maybe in a transport, where you're not necessarily so reliant on getting charges off as you would see with the 10-man brick coming down from Deep Strike. I think in this case it allows the Ioneer Hearthguard unit to have a little bit more punch into things that might be slightly tougher, obviously at the expense of taking away some of the potential devastating wounds. But as you may recall from our unit analysis video on the Hearthguard, the damage difference isn't actually all that much. That's lost anyway. In fact, it's actually quite comparable, and we still get a significant amount of devastating wounds that might go through, even if we're taking some out for the lethal hits. So I think it's a fair trade, and probably not as negative as some people might initially expect. Next up, we have a 10-man Hearthkyn warrior squad. You know him, you love him, they're essential in every list. They provide us with the ability to sticky objectives. They provide us usually with the ability to advance and still be eligible to shoot, to do actions. And most importantly, they allow us to fill Sagitars. Now on this list, we've taken a slightly different approach. Instead of taking the High-Las, which provides the unit with the assault keyword, we're actually opting for two of the bigger anti-vehicle weapons, being the Magna and the L7. Again, I think it's an interesting choice. I would personally go with the High-Las because I just feel, from my experience and just theoretically, it just feels a lot better on the table to have the option to advance and still be eligible to do an objective if need be, versus the potential somewhat negligible damage these guys might inflict. That said, it doesn't really matter all that much what you decide to equip these guys with. They rarely get to do any damage anyway, and they're mostly here, like I said, to fill the Sagitars and do secondaries for you. I suppose one of the trade-offs with excluding the Hylas to bring in the L7 and the Magna in this case does allow you the opportunity of surprise potentially in a game where your opponent might not be expecting this small chaff unit to actually be able to inflict any reasonable amount of damage onto their targets. But you never know, they may surprise your opponent and they may surprise you and end up doing a little bit of damage. As I mentioned, these guys will be filling the Sagitars, 2 in particular, and we are running 3 in this list. The third one being filled with the Chthonian Berserks, running 5 Mauls. I'm not sure if the pilot included the Mole Grenade Launcher, which is free. It doesn't show it on BCP, but I'm assuming he did because why not? It's free. We're running 5 Mauls here. Mauls are the superior weapon option at this time simply because they have access to damage 3 profiles. This is pretty impactful for the army. It allows your small 100-point unit to attack with a strength 9 weapon at decently high AP, especially if you compound that with a stratagem, and inflict 3 damage a pop. So they could punch pretty hard. Now the Sagitars are where things take an interesting twist. Usually we see the Hylas taken every time. Why? Because it's swingy, yes, it could whiff, but you have a pretty good chance of doing a significantly large amount of damage with just one vehicle. This means they're higher threat priority, it also means that they're more independent, and yes, they are by extension less predictable, which is usually bad, but because of how high they could punch, we usually forgive that. In this list, we've opted to actually take 3 L7s, 1 on each Sagitar, and this, I feel, is a very deliberate choice to provide some very impactful internal synergy to the list design. Let me explain. First of all, the Hylas comes in at 24-inch range, whereas the L7 comes in at 36 inches, which is a significantly longer range. This means not only do we have a larger threat range, but we're also able to play a little bit more defensive with our vehicles and still be able to inflict some continual and consistent damage. But is that worth missing out on the potential to spike? I think in this list, yes it is, because we've gone quite heavy on Brokir Thunderkyn. We actually not only have the 6-man brick, but we've also included a smaller 3-man brick with the Gravitons as well. This means that you have access to quite a lot of impactful anti-vehicle shooting in this list. It's also worth considering that the Brokir Thunderkyn, with their significantly shorter threat range of only 18-inch range plus 5-inch move, means that they're probably going to have to play mid-board or more aggressively than one might hope to do with some of their anti-tank. The Sagitars in this case don't need to overextend. They have the ability and the luxury of staying a little bit more defensive if you want to, and picking up targets with your 36-inch range gun. We also mentioned that the damage is swingy, it doesn't punch as high with a Hylas, but this isn't to discredit the damage output of the L7 at all. In fact, it's pretty good. At damage 3, you're running 3 of these, they're 2 shots each. You can probably pick something up if you shot all 3 of them into the target. That said, personally, I think it's always best to just run the Hylas, but I understand the conscious decision made in this list because of the internal balance and synergy that the pilot was going for. Moving along for vehicles, we have a Hecaton Land Fortress running the standard loadout of SP conversion beamers and twin bolt cannons. Absolute powerhouse, really durable. I love this unit and I always include 2 in my lists. Now I think with 1, you're probably going to suffer a little bit from priority targeting, but in this list, I actually think it plays the role firstly as a distraction Carnifex, and secondly as a delivery mechanism for either your 3-man Brokir Thunderkyn or your 5-man Ironir Hearthguard unit. We do have flexibility with these choices. Now I do see, and I mentioned that the Ironir Hearthguard are running the Teleport Crest on the 5-man unit, which makes for a pretty flexible deployment style. You can either put these in the Land Fort, or you could put them up in Deep Strike, or even start them on the table if you so desired. This also means you open up the possibility for putting your 3-man Brokir Thunderkyn into reserves because they have a much smaller footprint, and because of their small threat range, it means coming out of reserves into a priority target could make the difference as to whether or not you even get to shoot. So some very good flexibility, and like I said, very strong internal balance here. Last but not least, we have the inclusion of 3 3-man Pioneer squads. I absolutely love the Pioneers. I covered them in the last competitive unit analysis video, and I think that they are probably S tier for the Army simply because of how effective and efficient they are at going everywhere on the board, being a screener for you, being mobile, scoring secondaries, and just absolutely dominating mission play and board control. This, of course, fills a very nice gap in the list because, as you can probably imagine, there are a ton of points invested in this list into primary or damage dealing, and not a whole lot into secondary play. The Pioneers allow you to circumvent that because of how efficient they are at playing the board, playing the mission. They are fast, they go into reserves, they're reliable, and it's so easy for you to hold these guys back, screen out your deployment zone, and then just pop up and down to score whatever secondary cards you draw. You don't necessarily have to commit more points into other things, especially if you're running 3 squads of 3. You are investing overall fewer points into secondary play in your list design, but the points you are investing are guaranteed to get you value. A very strong choice and a very powerful complement to this beautifully internally balanced list. In terms of strengths, I think the best one right off the bat is that there is great internal synergy, as I mentioned throughout the list discussion section of this video. I think there are a lot of moving parts in this list, and all the units interact and complement each other quite well in order to achieve a very powerful take-all-comer style list where you are diversifying your threats and you are ensuring you have a response to anything your opponent might throw at you. Thanks to this, you also have access to very strong secondary play with the inclusion of the 3 minimum size squads of Pioneers. The last point I make here is balanced predictability, and by this I'm referring directly to that intentional interaction between the Brokier Thunderkyn Grav Cannon inclusion and the decision to run the L7 on your Sagitars instead of the Hylas. I think this decision shows a lot of high-level play and high-level decision-making put into the list design because we are accounting for trade-offs between units, we are factoring in unit roles and positioning before we even get to the table. That said, I do think that there are some weaknesses with this list, the first one being that I feel like it is very systematic. There are very clear sequences from which an opponent can prioritize targets and try to eliminate or avoid them entirely, being the Brokier Thunderkyn, or weathering the storm from your 3 damage shots on the Sagitars in order to get something into range and deliver a more punishing package to your midfield. I also think with just one inclusion of a Hecaton Land Fortress, yes, you get a distraction Carnifex, but what happens if your opponent simply ignores it? The Land Fort on its own isn't enough of a threat that it's going to actually hinder or destroy a lot of high priority targets on your opponent's side of the board, but it is annoying enough that you have to deal with it if it's on an objective scoring you primary. I think in this case, it's probably a very good inclusion, but if your opponent has a means for dealing with it effectively because there is only one, they're going to have an easier time systematically taking apart the rest of your list because I feel like the list plays in waves. It plays in different areas of the board. And if you have a good opponent who knows how to screen things out, who knows how to move block, or knows how to play around your ranges, I think they might be able to take advantage of this design choice and actually avoid unfavorable encounters. I also call out the distribution of the 4++. There's a question mark here. Again, I don't know if it's necessarily a weakness. I do definitely see the value in having one model in your 10-man brick be able to tank some of those high AP shots versus putting this in a 5-man, but I do feel like I'd much rather have that increased durability on my character once the squad goes. Conversely, again, it's a 10-man brick, so if you do lose the 10-man brick, you're basically guaranteed to lose the character because if your opponent has something that could deal with that unit, they'll have no problem picking up the character as well. So in this case, I could see how having a 4++ might allow you to get a little bit more value out of your 10-man brick and just keep your bodies alive a little bit longer. But it's just a 50-50 shot and they only have 2 wounds. So I feel like there are a lot of responses your opponent might have that pressure you to take these saves and possibly fail them. I put another question mark for predictability versus potential here. And By this, I refer to the trade-off between reliability, as we see with the L7 inclusion, versus the high-las, which has the potential to spike. I do understand that in terms of internal balance, it just makes sense to have something that plays a little bit more defensive if you have to, and picks things up at a longer range, and is more reliable in terms of its damage output, instead of having the riskiness of not necessarily being able to deliver the killing blow to any units. That said, a single Sagitar has the damage ceiling of 48 if everything goes well, and I just think it's not worth letting that go for the reliability of 3 damage, and the longer range that comes with it, of course. Again, this is absolutely not a weakness, it's more just a question that I would have for the pilot to know how he felt this setup performed, if he wishes he had access to slightly heavier guns, being the high-las, or if he thought the added range and reliability of the L7 was really impactful in his games. Alright, let's take a moment to quickly talk matchups. Game 1 against Necrons. Now, these Necrons were running the Hypercrypt Legion detachment, and they were running a C'tan, Shard of Nightbringer, a Void Dragon, a Locust Lord, a Transcendent C'tan, Canoptic Spiders, Deathmarks, Flayed Ones, Destroyers, and wrapping the list off with a Monolith. So a lot of heavy-duty, strong damage output units, tough to kill, tough to deal with, and to make matters worse, they teleport everywhere. I was really surprised to see such a big discrepancy in score here. I would have imagined it being a slightly tougher matchup than some of the other detachments Necrons could take, like Canoptic Court, for example, which I know has recently seen a slight increase in win rate when compared to Hypercrypt Legion. But I do think it's really annoying as a Votann player with pretty slow movement to have to deal with a non-committal list. By that I mean you commit your units somewhere and the Necron player could just take them and teleport somewhere else. They're able to get across the board instantly, and I think the biggest issue for us is catching up and being able to engage in combat with something that could just blink away. That said, I think this list screens very well, and that's what's probably key to this victory, is the ability for the Votann player to dictate where the Necron player can land. Think about all the assets that the Votann player is bringing to the table here in terms of ability to screen. You have the bikes, 3 squads of 3. You also have the long-range Sagitars, which, by inclusion of their long range, means that they can afford to play more defensively, maybe go somewhere and help contribute to screening while still being able to engage in the shooting phase with their extra range on the weapon profile. And of course, the inclusion of the Broker Thunderkyn, who may want to actually start on the table and be an absolute menace to the Monolith. With some average rolling, the 10-man Hearthguard brick should reliably be able to pick up a C'tan, especially with the inclusion of Grim Demeanor. This means, as by design with the list, you have a response to everything your opponent can throw at you, and you are ready to deal with it appropriately. Ultimately, I think the Votann's ability to screen so well and actually be able to commit and kill some of the Necron units very early on, and with ease when you consider the 10-man brick or the 6-man Broker Thunderkyn unit, means that you have a pretty good response to anything your opponent might throw at you while dominating the board state and ensuring the victory. Okay, game 2 into Grey Knights. For this game, the opponent was running 3 Brotherhood Librarians for a ton of Mortal Wound play, Tech Marine, Kaldor Drago, a ton of Terminators, 3 Nemesis Dread Knights, and a Kaleidos Assassin. Super annoying. Now, much like with the Necrons, this is another Blink army, meaning they get to often dictate where the fight is happening. What's really annoying is that these guys are actually quite powerful coming out of reserves and don't necessarily care if you're screening them out properly because they get to still dish out a ton of shots with the ability once per game to add 3 to their charge roll. The native fallback shoot and charge on Nemesis Dread Knights is also a little bit annoying for us to deal with, again because it makes them so non-committal. They get to dictate which fights they want to be a part of, and they get to teleport everywhere that they want to. They simply outmaneuver us. I will say it was a very close game, and I think this is for very similar reasons as we covered with the Necron matchup, in that we actually see that this list performs quite well into these mobile armies because of our ability to screen so effectively. We also have pretty decent responses to anything that is tough, and the Broker Thunder can pack a ton of damage to shooting. That could potentially push Terminators to their invulnerable save if they aren't benefiting from cover or their equivalent of Armor of Contempt. A very close game overall, where both players have an army capable of taking control of the board state, dominating on primary with their added OC, and being able to go for secondaries across the board. I'd be very curious to learn what worked and what didn't for the pilot in this matchup, if it really came down to an unlucky dice roll or if there's something he could have done better to maybe help secure the victory. What do you guys think the main difference was between the Hypercrypt matchup and what we saw here with the Grey Knights? Let me know in the comments down below. Okay, game 3, Votann 100 to Imperial Guard at 54. I do think Votann played pretty well into Imperial Guard, namely because we have decent durability, we're pretty good at killing anti-infantry with the sheer amount of volume we have for our shots, and we're also effective into vehicles, especially light vehicles, where the damage turn the L7 in this case is actually pretty impactful. I think in this game, where the Imperial Guard list was actually surprisingly very light on battle line infantry, it was probably pretty easy for the Votann player to systematically pick up whatever units he felt were the biggest threat to primary in this game very quickly if his opponent tried to engage him, while also being reliably able to pick up the anti-tanks. I wouldn't be surprised if he put the Thunderkyn into reserves in this case, because even a 3-man unit coming out of reserves would be able to pick up any one of these light vehicles that you see in the list. I'd be curious to hear the pilot's thoughts on which matchups he felt his Brokir were better off being in reserves versus starting on the table, and how much of an impact the deployment had against certain matchups like we see here with the Imperial Guard. Game 4 into Genestealer Cults. Full disclosure, I won't pretend to understand how Genestealer Cults play. I have not played against them this edition, so I'm really not sure what they actually do. I do understand that they're quite annoying with the significant amount of horde units that they're able to put out on the table. I know they nerfed the ability to resurrect and bring the whole unit back, but I think you still get that option on a 3+, if I'm not mistaken. What this ultimately looks like for me, and what I can deduce from looking at the list here, is that, again, we're really leaning into our ability to deal with anti-infantry based on the weapon profile of most of our datasheets, namely our Terminators. These guys will reliably be able to pick up a 20-man squad, even the 5-man to be honest, coming out of a land fort. In return, I also think that we're durable enough that the output provided by most of the Genestealer Cult units isn't enough to actually hurt us all that bad. Again, we see some very light vehicles here that we're allied in, and I think we have adequate responses to this between the 3 Sagitars with the L7s and the 2 units of Brokir Thunderkyn, which are reliably able to wound these on 2s. Ultimately, I think we effectively deal with whatever they're throwing at us on the board and trying to swarm onto objectives, which means we come out on top on primary, and we also have the maneuverability with our bikes to go around the board and complete secondaries for us towards the end of the game without necessarily worrying about what our opponent throws at them, because they're able to also pick up light infantry units. For the final game of the event, we have Volten at 98 into Death Guard at 75. A pretty interesting Death Guard list, bringing in some allied units for Nurglings and also 3 War Dogs. In this list, we're actually building around the liability of Death Guard's slow movement by balancing that out with some of the faster moving targets like the War Dogs and some of the cheaper things that we're trying to use to screen with, as we see with the allied demons. All in all, it means we have the resilience and the durability that Death Guard natively have, coupled with the mobility and the firepower of the War Dogs and the objective play of the Nurglings. A really well-balanced list and quite powerful. I do think effective target prioritization would be key in this matchup, and the Sagitars at 3 damage apiece with the L7s are still going to be effective into Death Guard Rhinos. I think this means we have quite a few responses, particularly against the War Dogs, because of the Brokir Thunderkyn that we're bringing in. I know I downplayed the Brokir Thunderkyn at the beginning of this video, but looking at these matchups here, I'm kind of starting to see a little bit of the value in including them in the list. I think in terms of token allocation for this matchup, we actually benefit from the inclusion of Brokir Thunderkyn because we don't need to allocate tokens to the War Dogs, which otherwise you might want to. Which means we get to actually put them on the Death Guard Rhinos or the Terminators, and even onto the Plague Marines if we so choose to. We get to reliably pick these things up, and we get to pick up whatever comes out from inside them. Once these threats are dealt with, there isn't really all that much that the Death Guard player can do to actually stop us from dominating primary. We also, in my opinion, have stronger secondary play with the bikes. Because yes, there are Nurglings, they're very annoying, they sit somewhere on the board, they screen, they do a secondary for you, but I think our bikes are natively faster, and they could probably kill the Nurgling squads. simply through the weight of fire and access to damage to weapons. All in all, another good game for the Votan player, and one that I would actually strongly attribute the victory here to the Brocare Thunderkyn, who were able to reliably deal with the larger threats being the brigands that are running at you. I know Junior has watched one of our videos in the past and commented in the comment section below, so Junior, if you're watching this, feel free to share some more details on some of these games. I'd love to read about it and how you felt the units in your list were best utilized. So another big congratulations to Junior Aflagi for taking 7th out of 49 players at the Los Angeles Classic GT, and a big congratulations to everybody else who attended this event. As always, a big thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this kind of content, please do subscribe to the channel. It really helps a lot. Leave me a like and a comment down below, and I will get back to you. If you want to engage a little bit more with the Votann community, feel free to join our Discord using the link in the description below, which of course is free of charge. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.